Hello, this is Mark Grier, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 5th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, let's start off. First article for today. Trump wants a quick victory in Iran, but the war may be costly. The opening days of the conflict are challenging the idea that President Trump can project force abroad while safeguarding American lives and the economy. As President Trump uses U.S. military forces overseas, his calculation has been that he can launch military operations with the loss of a few American lives and minimal disruption to the economy. The opening days of the war in Iran are challenging that assumption. Already, 6 Americans have been killed. Gulf allies are under attack. The stock market wobbled. Gas prices are rising. The U.S. military is spending, by some estimates, hundreds of millions of dollars per day. In Iran, an airstrike on a girls' elementary school killed 175 people, according to local health officials and Iranian state media. And the Trump administration says it is investigating who was responsible. While no American ground troops have yet been sent to Iranian soil, the administration has not ruled out deploying soldiers. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on Wednesday suggested the conflict might not be short. "We are accelerating, not decelerating," Mr. Hegseth told reporters, adding, "More bombers and more fighters are arriving just today." Before deciding to launch a new round of missile strikes against Iran that began on Saturday, Mr. Trump had been emboldened by what his administration views as a string of swift military achievements. Under Trump's leadership, the U.S. military captured Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, in a quickly executed operation, struck Iran's nuclear facilities in a surprise attack, targeted Houthi militants in Yemen, blew up a succession of suspected drug boats in the Caribbean, and bombed targets in Iraq, Nigeria, and Somalia as part of counterterrorism operations. All of these operations were carried out quickly and, in the administration's view, successfully, with little cost to American lives or treasure. But the war the United States and Israel have launched against Iran runs the risk of spiraling beyond those quick strike operations, particularly if the administration further involves itself in regime change. Representative Jason Crow, a Colorado Democrat and former Army Ranger who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, warned Wednesday that the United States was headed down the same path of endless war that he had seen firsthand and that Mr. Trump had campaigned against. After trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, decades of endless conflict, my entire adult life, a quarter of a century of American war, here we go again, Mr. Crow said. Donald Trump campaigned on ending the wars because he knew at the time that that's what Americans wanted and still want. And yet, here we go again. Mr. Trump has encouraged the people of Iran to take over their country, but he has not backed any specific entity to lead the fight against the government. Since launching strikes, Mr. Trump has spoken with Kurdish leaders, but has not agreed to any plan to arm them to overthrow the Iranian government. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said on Wednesday. Trump is an individual who likes low costs and flashy what he considers victories, said John Hoffman, a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. Everything that I hear from folks in the administration and around the administration is that after Maduro, he was running high. he felt untouchable in many ways. But this is fundamentally different than Venezuela. The costs are already racking up. Mr. Hoffman pointed out to the dead U.S. service members and the spiking of oil and natural gas prices. I think Europe's natural gas prices went up about 40%, and this is only going to get worse, he said. These prices are going to continue to rise. Still, Elliot Abrams, a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, who worked for 3 Republican presidents, including Mr. Trump, said he believed there were many benefits to killing the leaders of Iran and dismantling the country's military capacity. The costs are so far are the lives lost to American service members, he said. The benefits are, I think, enormous. This regime has been trying and sometimes succeeding in killing Americans for more than 40 years. Mr. Abrams said that if Mr. Trump declines to send in ground troops, American deaths may remain low. But a decimated Iranian regime, he said, was ultimately in the interest of America and its allies. Even if regime remnants remain in power, they'll have no nuclear program, essentially no ballistic missile program, and no ability to project power in the region, he said. But Mr. Hoffman isn't so sure, arguing destabilized Iran could pose a high risk to America and its allies. If it really is the plan to start arming ethnic separatist groups and try to balkanize Iran, he said, not only would that be a proxy war at a scale at which the United States has never engaged before in the Middle East, that will impose incredible costs on the region. In that scenario, Mr. Hoffman said, you're likely talking mass refugee flows. You're likely talking about time and space for groups like ISIS to start taking a foothold, he added. There are groups that just thrive on chaos. You're opening Pandora's box. Okay, moving on. Next article. Iran calls torpedoing of ship by U.S. an atrocity. Iran's foreign minister accused the United States of committing an atrocity at sea after a U.S. Navy submarine attacked an Iranian frigate in the Indian Ocean. Iran's foreign minister accused the United States of committing an atrocity at sea on Thursday, a day after an American submarine torpedoed an Iranian frigate off the southern coast of Sri Lanka. The warship, the Iris Dina, had recently participated in a peacetime naval exercise that India hosted from February 14th to the 25th. It was sailing outside of Sri Lanka to territorial waters when it sent a distress signal at 5:08 a.m. local time. The Sri Lanka foreign minister told the country's parliament that Sri Lanka responded by sending naval ships and its air force to the damaged vessel. As of Thursday, Sri Lanka security forces said the bodies of 84 sailors who died in the attack had been recovered, with the Sri Lanka Navy still searching for 64 others. The 32 rescued sailors had been taken to Sri Lanka's Gali National Hospital. Iran's Navy has been under heavy fire since Saturday, with its warships at times appearing poorly defended. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Times showed multiple vessels ablaze in port for more than a day, with few visible efforts to move or salvage them. On Wednesday, Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, touted the attacks as an example of American military might. America is winning decisively devastatingly and without mercy, Mr. Hegseth said at the Pentagon briefing where he announced the sinking. He said that the Iranian ship thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo, he said. In a social media post on Thursday, the Iranian's foreign minister condemned the attack, saying that the ship had been a guest of India's Navy. The U.S. will come to bitterly regret the precedent it has set, he had said. The incident has created a challenge for India's Prime Minister, who has yet to publicly comment on the strike. He is already facing criticism that his government has taken an overly timid stance on the U.S. and Israel's attack on Iran, a key partner, amid his efforts to smooth tariff frictions with Washington. The conflict has reached our backyard, with an Iranian warship sunk in the Indian Ocean. Yet the Prime Minister has said nothing, said the rival opposition politician he had written on social media. In his own social media post, the president of the Indian National Congress, the primary opposition party, accused their leader of betraying India's strategic and national interests. A second Iranian ship remains floating off Sri Lanka's coast, a senior official told the country's parliament on Thursday. Cabinet spokesman Nalinda Justisa said the country's authorities would intervene to reduce loss of lives and resolve the problem. Okay, let's move on to the next article. Trump follows his gut. His national security advisors try to keep up. Decisions come fast, even if contradictions and inconsistencies abound. But without much of a process, there is little preparation for how things can go wrong. Sitting beside Germany's chancellor in the Oval Office on Tuesday, President Trump offered a brief moment of insight into the decision-making process in the White House on the most consequential of matters, whether to take the country to war. His decision to order the attack on Iran, he said, was mostly a matter of gut instinct about Iranian intentions. We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first, he said, while his guest, Friedrich Merz, sat expressionless. I think they were going to attack first, and I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand, but Israel was ready, and we were also ready. Set aside for a moment that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had offered the opposite explanation the previous day, telling reporters that because Israel was going to act, Mr. Trump had no choice but to join what he called a preemptive strike before Iran counterattacked U.S. bases and allies. The next day, Mr. Rubio tried to walk back his comments. Then, on Wednesday, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said Mr. Trump acted because he had a good feeling that Iran would soon strike American interests. The back and forth confirmed that his former aides almost universally report that Mr. Trump's determination to cut out the bureaucracy, to reduce his advisors to a tiny, leak-proof few, and to trust instinct over intelligence briefings, applied as he made the gravest decision a commander-in-chief can make. Every president, of course, creates a decision-making structure tailor-made for his own style. Franklin Roosevelt relied heavily on a kitchen cabinet. Harry Truman created the National Security Council to formally weigh options and coordinate among departments fighting the Cold War. Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter turned the NSC into an idea generator. In the Obama administration, members of the NSC staff talked about death by situation room meeting and compared the process of policymaking to watching a python swallow a pig. The Trump administration doesn't have much patience for that. When he came to office, Mr. Trump reduced the size of the NSC staff by at least 2/3, casting out some of its members because of vague and being suspicious about their loyalty. Mr. Trump has made clear that his NSC is not there to generate options, but to execute his decisions. And when debates take place, the number of players often shrinks to a tiny group. In the Iran case, Mr. Rubio, Vice President J.D. Vance, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, the four-star head of Central Command, Brad Cooper, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane. Mr. Trump loves the chairman's nickname, Raisin Kane, just as he loved Mad Dog for his first defense secretary, Jim Mattis, who hated the moniker. Not much leaks from those sessions, a major change from, say, the early Obama era, when Situation Room conversations sometimes appeared on news websites before the meetings were even over. Still, it was widely reported that General Kane warned Mr. Trump that he needed to expect casualties and that he would have to deal with the real possibility of munitions shortages. Mr. Vance's public silences could be explained by his initial internal cautions against entering the war. Once he lost the battle, Mr. Vance told the president and his national security team that they should go big and go fast. But what Mr. Trump gains in secrecy, he loses in message control. On a range of issues, from the goals of the Iran attack or the Iran strike to Mr. Trump's objectives in Venezuela, or even in threatening Greenland, there are a blitz of answers. Inconsistency is sometimes celebrated by the administration as wily strategic deception, rather than as a failure to think several chess moves ahead. Trump seems to think he doesn't need options or contingency plans, says Thomas Wright, a scholar at the Brookings Institute who worked a long-term strategic planning in the National Security Council during the Biden years. He just wants a small team to execute his instincts. But when events go wrong, as they often do, a president without prepared choices will be gambling with a pair of twos. That is what has many foreign ministers, defense officials, and world leaders worried. A top Arab diplomat said this week that his government has no real insight into the administration's planning for a transition of government in Iran, or even whether it wants to play a role, given Mr. Hegseth's repeated statements that nation building was not on the Pentagon's list of tasks. People familiar with Mr. Mertz's visit say he pressed on whether the president has thought ahead to how and under what conditions the action in Iran might end. In other administrations, these are the kinds of questions the National Security Council would be tasked to answer. It would also have been the NSC's role to make sure there was plenty of warning to U.S. citizens to leave the Middle East. Instead, that advice came from the government only after the fighting was well underway, leaving thousands of Americans stranded. David Rothkopf, the author of Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the architects of American power, said he was struck by the absence of basic process. Never has so much risk or such sweeping military action of so much consequence been undertaken with so little apparent planning, or weighing of potential consequences, both intended and unintended, he said. It is the military, he notes, that develops operational plans, which are then vetted at the NSC. That process has atrophied to virtually nothing in this administration, and what planning there has been is often ignored by a president who trusts his own instincts more than any advisors. That may work with actions that are narrow in scope, but it does not when waging war against a large, consequential country like Iran. Perhaps Mr. Trump was emboldened by the fact that his previous missions have worked out well. The June 2025 air attack on Iran's 3 major nuclear sites was a product of months of careful planning, and the targets were all deep underground facilities that the United States thought it could damage severely with a dozen giant bunker-busting bombs. The calculations were more about physics than politics. The mission was limited. Most of the targets were so remote that there was little worry about civilian casualties. The operation to remove Nicolas Maduro from power was riskier, but Mr. Trump made no effort to truly change the government. Instead, he kept the power structure of the country in place, save for Mr. Maduro, and made it clear that he was not going to insist on the installation of the clear winners of a 2024 election, the Venezuelan opposition, as long as the United States had access to Venezuela's huge oil reserves. But veterans of that long, often drawn-out National Security Council process say that it is exactly the kind of imperfect analogy that the president's staff should be deflating. Iran and Venezuela could not be more different in history, geography, culture, or politics. Their biggest commodity is their reliance on pumping oil out of the ground. Mr. Trump said in an interview with the Times that he hoped that the hardened members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia would just surrender their arms to the people, which sounded more like hope than a plan. But his political supporters see the conversation about strategic planning as a wonky effort to keep Trump from being Trump. After all, they noted, the supreme leader perished in one of the first strikes of the war. Mr. Trump's critics see in this conflict everything that is wrong with the working of the Trump White House. The president and his administration keep shifting their rationale for the war, the length and level of commitment to the war, the goals for the war, and whether or not we're actually at war at all, said Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware. The only thing that has remained constant in the lack of strategy for how to wage it. That's what happens when you launch a war based on gut feelings rather than analysis and advice from experts. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, let's move on to the next article. If you liked the Texas primaries, you'll love the sequel. Texas voters will revisit the Republican Senate primary and some House races where no candidate captured more than 50% of the votes in runoffs on May 26th. Texas got the 2026 midterm election calendar underway with a slate of primaries that drew rare turnout, record-setting spending, and remarkable national attention. But as bruising as Tuesday's primaries were, some candidates are just getting ready for round two. Because the state's electoral system requires that primary candidates receive an outright majority in the votes, its primary elections are often multi-stage affairs. Late winter primary days narrow, crowded races down to one-on-one contests and give way to spring runoff elections. A lot can change in between. In 2012, a Tea Party-backed insurgent named Ted Cruz got new life after finishing more than 10 points behind an establishment favorite in a Republican Senate primary race. The contest went to a runoff. Mr. Cruz won head-to-head and then won the general election. He has served in the Senate ever since. Here are some of the high-profile races headed to runoffs on May 26. U.S. Senate, John Cornyn versus Ken Paxton. The rancorous three-way Republican primary for Senate between Senator John Cornyn, the longtime incumbent, Ken Paxton, the scandal-scarred state attorney general, and Representative Wesley Hunt, ended with Mr. Hunt knocked out, finishing a distant third. The result set in motion a rematch with essentially the same dynamic. Mr. Cornyn and Mr. Paxton in a virtual dead heat. But President Trump said on Wednesday that he would soon endorse one of the candidates and ask the other to drop out, potentially rendering the sequel significantly less riveting than this week's original, given this considerable sway he holds in GOP primaries. The 18th Congressional District has Christian Menefee versus Al Green. Representative Al Green, a Democrat known for acts of protest at Mr. Trump's speeches to Congress, is headed to a runoff with a House newcomer, Representative Christian Menefee. Mr. Green, who is 78, and Mr. Menefee is 37, were effectively drawn into the same Houston area district last summer. A third Democrat on the ballot, Amanda Edwards, prevented either candidate from reaching the 50% of the vote needed to advance. In the 33rd Congressional District, Colin Allred versus Julie Johnson. Former Representative Colin Allred, a Democrat, is headed to a runoff against Representative Julie Johnson in a newly drawn Dallas area House district. Mr. Allred, a former NFL linebacker, gave up his seat in 2024 to run for the Senate, and briefly ran for the Senate against this cycle before switching to the House race. Neither he nor Ms. Johnson, a first-term Congresswoman, came particularly close to winning a majority of the vote Thursday in their four-way primaries. Ms. Johnson is the first openly gay House member from a southern state, according to her office. State Attorney General Chip Roy versus Mays Middleton. Representative Chip Roy, a fourth-term Republican and longtime House rabble-rouser, who has spoken with Mr. Trump on the 2020 election and other issues, is heading to a runoff in the race for for State Attorney General. Mr. Roy faces State Senator Mays Middleton, an oil executive who has accused him of being disloyal to the president. Mr. Middleton led Mr. Roy in the four-way primary held on Tuesday. Okay, next in a related article, James Tallarico says new politics is being born after his Texas primary win. After clinching the Democratic State Senate primary, he told supporters in Austin that the country's real divide is between top versus bottom, not the left versus the right. James Tallarico, the state lawmaker and seminarian who won the Democratic Senate primary in Texas, took aim at billionaires in his victory speech on Wednesday night and said the country's true division were between its haves and have-nots. The real fight in this country is not left versus right, Mr. Tallarico, who made a point of trying to appeal to moderates and disaffected Republican during his campaign, told supporters in Austin, "It's top versus bottom." He began his remarks by praising the opponent he defeated in the primary, Representative Jasmine Crockett, saying that he was grateful for her voice and her leadership, and pledging to work to earn the trust of her supporters. Then, in a brief address that blended his Christian faith with denunciations of billionaires, he rallied supporters and tried to build on the recent surge of enthusiasm among Texas Democrats, who hope to win in the Senate seat in their deep red state for the first time since 1988. "We're done being divided," he said. "We're done being played. We're done being pitted against each other. That old politics is dying and a new politics is being born." Mr. Tallarico is vying to succeed Senator John Cornyn, a four-term Republican incumbent who is himself trying to beat back a vigorous primary challenge from Ken Paxton, the hard-right, scandal-plagued state attorney general. Since neither Republican won a majority of the vote Tuesday, they are headed to a runoff in May. President Trump indicated Wednesday that he would endorse one of the Republicans and called on the other candidate he does not back to drop out. Mr. Paxton later said that he had no plans to leave the race, even if he fails to secure the president's endorsement. More than $70 million was spent by groups trying to help Senator Cornyn prevail. Ad Impact, a media tracking firm, said that was the most ever spent for a Senate incumbent in a primary. Mr. Tallarico used his speech to welcome voters of all kinds, Democrats, independents, Republicans, and young people. "If you hate politics and you've never voted before, you have a home in this campaign," he said. In the crowd, Stephanie Gill, 48, said she was first drawn to Mr. Tallarico after hearing about him from her son, Jonah, who is 16, and that she learned more about him on TikTok and Instagram. She praised him for being anti-corruption and not like your regular politician. Okay, moving on. Next article. What the extraordinary market volatility in Asia says about energy and AI. Stocks in South Korea and Taiwan, the center of global chip making, plunged on fears about energy prices. Their recovery shows the bullishness over artificial intelligence. Stocks across most of Asia rallied on Thursday, a day after tumbling over fears around the region's heavy reliance on imported oil and gas. The turnaround illustrates the hair-trigger reactions of investors around the world who are trying to assess the immediate and possible long-term effects of the strikes on Iran by the United States and Israel, and the repercussions around the Persian Gulf, where much of the world's oil and gas is produced. The swing was particularly stark for South Korea's Kospi Index, which had dropped 12% in its worst single-day crash, then turned around to close nearly 10% higher on Thursday. At one point on Wednesday, the plunge was so rapid that trading was temporarily halted to stem the losses. Stocks in Taiwan also swung, falling more than 4% on Wednesday before jumping nearly 3% 24 hours later. The recovery in Asia took the lead from trading on Wednesday in the United States, where stocks opened higher for the first time all week after President Trump suggested that the U.S. Navy may escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, and President Emmanuel Macron of France called for an international coalition to help secure commercial shipping routes. Over the past year, intense optimism about artificial intelligence has led investors to pour money into tech stocks in Taiwan and South Korea. The two places make most of the equipment, like computer chips and servers that power the world's AI systems. They are also on imports for virtually all of their energy. The stock market seesaw served as a reminder not only of the central role that these two East Asian democracies play in the global economy, but how bullish investors remain about AI. Jim Fontanelli, a senior analyst at Arete Research, an equity research firm, said the movement in the stocks was not a reflection of a change in the fundamentals of AI. Questions around AI optimism have been a consistent theme for all these stocks over the past few years, he said. The conflict has little direct impact on that question. In February, the share prices of many of the East Asia's biggest companies climbed to record highs, including Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which makes chips for Apple and NVIDIA, as well as Samsung, which manufacture memory chips for NVIDIA's sought-after AI servers. All three closed lower on Wednesday and then recovered. The conflict in the Middle East probably does not directly impact the fundamental demand for companies like TSMC and Samsung, said Wei Sung Ling, an equities advisor based in Singapore at the Bank Union. Heavy investment in AI infrastructure could continue for years, even with the war. Yet, a prolonged and even wider conflict in the Middle East that interrupts the supply of energy to Asia could damage the electricity-intense production of chips. Since they are so dependent on imported oil and gas, Asia's semiconductor manufacturing hubs would bear the brunt of the shock from any energy disruption, said Randy Yang, an analyst at the TrendForce, a market research firm in Taipei. The build-out of AI infrastructure in the United States faces a lower risk from the Persian Gulf conflict, since America can rely on its own sources of energy, Mr. Yang has said. Okay, shifting gears here to another article. Harry Styles left as a dominant male pop star. He returns to a crowd. In the 4 years since the British singer last released an album, artists like Somber, working in similar aesthetic modes, have climbed onto the charts. Following Harry Styles' solo career is a little like getting a crash course in the male archetypes of the 2010s and 2020s. In his 2017 debut, Harry Styles, released a year after his mega-selling boy band One Direction went on indefinite hiatus, he was the playful star in louche suits, writing arena rock about broken hearts and one-night stands. For 2019's Fine Line, he embraced light androgyny, appearing on the cover of Vogue in a dress and donning glittery cat suits as he traded seriousness for psych rock ambulance. The styles of 2022's Harry's House was the guy you know who's in mid-century furniture and the kind of big, expensive pants that sell for 4+ figures at Venn Space. The album, accordingly, dealt in light-touch synth arrangements inspired by, he said, Japanese city pop. By speed running so many distinct aesthetics in such a short time, Styles was, in a sense, doing some heavy lifting for the rest of his musical brethren. During the 2000s and 2010s, white male stars tended to fit distinct archetypes, slick and well-groomed, like Justin Timberlake, perpetually teenage, like Justin Bieber, perpetually normie, like Ed Sheeran. There was not a lot of changeability in those modes. When Timberlake rebranded as a man of the woods in 2018, he was met with widespread derision. Unlike stars of the decades past like David Bowie and George Michael, whose modes shifted with each successive album cycle, or sometimes from video to video. For his fourth solo album due Friday, Kiss All the Time, Disco Occasionally, Styles has revealed another new guy. On the album's cover, he is depicted in jeans, big sunglasses, and a baby tee. Styles said he discovered LCD sound system and Berlin club culture between records, and accordingly has adopted a casual clubgoer uniform. An impression made clearer by his recent performance at the Brit Awards, during which he was surrounded by a swarm of dancers wearing the same thing. Styles sported a shirt and tie tucked into pinstripe pants as he danced around the stage, the working man finally cutting loose. Kiss All the Time, Disco Occasionally is Styles' first album in 4 years. His success with Harry's House and its subsequent Love on Tour shows arguably reopen the floodgates for male pop stars, which have been making their way back in the Hot 100. Benson Boone, a one-time American Idol hopeful, has parlayed TikTok popularity and a propensity for doing flips while wearing styles like spandex into a number of chart hits, while the former YouTube prankster Alex Warren's 2025 single Ordinary was one of last year's biggest successes, sitting at number 1 for 10 weeks. Bieber, now a father, broke out of his adolescent prison with Swag, an album of minimal R&B indebted to the influence of the indie stars Dijon and MKG. And, of course, there's Shane Booz, a 20-year-old New Yorker, better known as Somber. Somber broke through in 2025 with a series of singles that quickly filtered up from TikTok and into the Billboard Hot 100 chart, including the dense, angsty mega hit Back to Friends. His sound is distinct from Styles's. It's rooted in posh of the 2010s indie band with shades of disco, produced and mixed with sparkle and intensity of pop music, but there's undeniably a bit of Styles in his persona, which is both safely puppyish and safely sexualized and appeals to young female audiences. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, next article is from the opinion section, an article by Peter Klein. Trump is playing a dangerous game with Iran. Take over your government, President Trump urged Iranians as bombs began raining down this past weekend. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. It was a stirring call, drawing on the dream of democracy and the promise of liberation. The United States has issued it to other nations many times in the past and it tends to end in disaster. During the Cold War, Radio Free Europe broadcasts encouraged the people of Hungary, my parents among them, to rise up, offering guidance on tactics and strategies and leading many listeners to believe they would receive U.S. military assistance. On October 23, 1956, Hungarians took to the streets, publicly lynching officers of the communist secret police. A new government formed under Imre Nagy and announced that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact. Western help never came. Russian tanks rolled in. My parents watched soldiers open fire on a busy square. Between 2,500 and 3,000 Hungarians were killed during the Soviet crackdown. Tens of thousands were arrested, including Nagy, who was later executed. Something similar played out in 1961 as Cuban exiles prepared to invade their homeland and overthrow Fidel Castro, with the promise of U.S. air cover. The military support failed to materialize. More than 100 rebel combatants were killed at the Bay of Pigs. More than 1,000 were captured, and Castro emerged stronger, emboldened in ways that set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. We saw it again in the 1980s when the United States funded and armed Afghan militia in their war against Soviet occupation. This time, American support of revolutionaries did initially succeed. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, but so did American support. What followed was a civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and radicalization of Mujahideen members like Osama bin Laden, and eventually 20 years of American war. In 1991, after Operation Desert Storm drove Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush called on Iraqis to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside. Iraq's Shiite majority rose up in rebellion, driving those forces out of the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. Within days, Saddam's Republican Guard regained the upper hand. Army forces rounded up rebels, torturing, raping, and murdering them in Shiite mosques, or using helicopters to pour kerosene on them and set them on fire. Washington decided not to intervene. Tens of thousands died. In all of these instances, the body count tells only part of the story. A bitter sense of betrayal lasts for generations. In 2003, 2 decades after Washington abandoned those Shiite rebels in Iraq, my 60 Minutes colleague Bob Simon and I sat down with Muqtada al-Shire, then a young Shiite cleric, which was at the heart of Saddam's 1991 crackdown. We asked him whether he was thankful that the United States had at last toppled Iraqi Shiites' oppressor. With the first Gulf War still fresh in his mind, he replied, "The little serpent has left, and the great serpent has come." Authoritarian regimes rarely just collapse. With everything on the line, they fight back, often brutally. That's why real regime change takes more than just the removal of an individual leader. It takes weapons, logistics, and intelligence. It takes time and money and American lives. Too often, presidents take a big gamble at the outset, but reassess their priorities when the costs become clear. What gets left out of that reassessment are the people who believed the promises, the Hungarians who took the streets of Budapest, the Iraqi Shiites who seized control of their cities, the Cuban exiles who waited ashore. In the case of Iran today, the obstacles are especially daunting. While the majority of Iranians oppose their nation's ruling regime, there is no clear, organized movement with recognized leadership to lead them out of it. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is large, powerful, and brutal. More than 6,800 civilians died during the recent protests against the regime, according to a U.S.-based human rights group. Some estimates are many times higher. Numerous military analysts say that without the arrival of weapons or ground troops, Iran's rebels have little hope of success. In addition, many Iranians are skeptical of America's intentions and mindful of the last time this country effected regime change in Iran, in 1953, when the CIA helped to overthrow a democratically elected leader and return the Shah to power. If popular uprising did succeed, internal divisions could cause the nation to fracture, creating the kind of power vacuum that has derailed U.S. interests before in places such as Baghdad and Kabul, this time with the country potentially on the brink of developing nuclear weapons. Watching the violent crackdown on protesters in Tehran reminded me of scenes that my parents described in Budapest in 1956. Without overt U.S. intervention, it took more than 3 decades for Soviet control to end there. Will the United States stick around now to support the Iranians it is goading into dangerous uprising? Or will it achieve its military goals and move on? The rhetoric of liberation is cheap, whereas the cost of actually delivering on it is not. The people who believe the promises are the ones who bear the price. That has been true across nearly a century of American foreign policy. Before Iranians bet their lives on the United States' commitment, they deserve to know the odds. Okay, moving on. Probably last article for today. House panel votes to subpoena Pam Bondi over Epstein files. The Oversight Committee took the action over the objections of its Republican chairman after several GOP members sided with Democrats to insist on it. A key House committee voted on Wednesday to subpoena Attorney General Pam Bondi to compel her to testify about the Justice Department's investigation of the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and its release of investigative material about him, after Republicans sided with Democrats to insist on it. Over the objection of the panel's Republican chairman, Representative James Comer of Kentucky, 5 Republicans on the Oversight Committee joined Democrats to force approval of the subpoena, which was introduced by Representative Nancy Mace, Republican of South Carolina. The vote, 24-19, was a striking rebuke of a top Trump administration official by members of President Trump's own party at a time when the Republican-controlled Congress has generally marched in step with him. It was also the second time in the past year that Republican members of the Oversight Committee, the House's chief investigative panel, had crossed party lines to force action around Mr. Epstein, the disgraced financier who died in federal custody in 2019 while facing sex trafficking charges. The Republicans who voted for the subpoena were Ms. Mace and Representatives Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Michael Cloud of Texas, and Scott Perry of Pennsylvania. Under the committee's rules, Mr. Comer will be required to issue the subpoena for a closed-door deposition, in which Ms. Bondi will be under oath. The setting may force Ms. Bondi to contend more seriously with lawmakers' questions than at a congressional hearing, where officials often perform for live television cameras and fall back on prepared talking points. Though the Oversight Committee tends to be among the most strictly partisan panels in Congress, Republican leaders have repeatedly had to contend with defections connected to the Epstein scandal, which has become a potent political issue that has exposed rifts in Mr. Trump's political coalition. Before Wednesday's vote, Mr. Comer tried to fend off the subpoena, saying that Ms. Bondi's chief of staff told him that the Attorney General would brief lawmakers about her department's investigation into Epstein. During the vote, as Ms. Mace's effort looked poised to succeed, he made a last-ditch effort and reminded members that the Attorney General has offered to come in and give briefings. But lawmakers from both parties have been angered by the Justice Department's handling of the Epstein files, dating back to Ms. Bondi's reversal last year on a promise to release previously undisclosed material in the case. Ms. Mace and Ms. Boebert were among just 4 Republicans who broke with Mr. Trump last year and joined Democrats to force the House to vote on a bill that mandated the release of the files. Faced with the certain prospect of that measure passing, Republican leaders dropped their objections, and Mr. Trump signed the bill into law. The Justice Department released millions of pages of documents in separate batches in December and January, but instead of quieting the clamor, the disclosures have seemed only to stoke it. Members of Congress have accused Ms. Bondi and her top deputy, Todd Blanche, of slow-walking the release of the files or improperly withholding material in violation of the law. Though the Justice Department was instructed to redact sexually explicit imagery and information that could be used to identify victims, it originally published dozens of unredacted nude images on its website, showing young women or possibly teenagers. And during congressional hearings last month, Ms. Bondi faced withering criticism over the Justice Department's inadvertent release of victims' identities and its sweeping redactions that lawmakers said violated the Epstein law. Representative Robert Garcia of California, the top Democrat on the Oversight Committee, said before Wednesday's vote that he backed the subpoena because he wanted Ms. Bondi to directly answer questions about the release of the files and about ensuring that victims and survivors are protected. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 5th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Your reader today has been Mark Reier. Thank you so much for listening.